Hey everyone, welcome to Dr. Sleep. We love creating unique content for you, but we need your support now more than ever. Our channel is facing some challenges, and we really need your interaction. If you enjoy what we offer, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share our videos with your friends. Every comment, like, and share makes a huge difference. Let's grow together and keep bringing you the content you care about. Thank you for your continued support. Josh adjusted the lens on his camera, his hands trembling with a mix of anticipation and nerves. All right, Dave, this is it. Beyond the Veil investigation's first real case. Dave smirked, leaning back in his chair and twirling a pen. First case, first potential disaster. You sure we're not biting off more than we can chew? Josh rolled his eyes. A haunted mansion that supposedly leads to another dimension? What's not to love? The internet will eat this up. We need to start somewhere, and this legend is perfect. The legend of the mansion had taken the online paranormal world by storm. It was an estate nestled deep in the woods, its exact location a whispered secret among locals. The stories spoke of explorers who entered, never to return, or of people emerging days later, raving about impossible hallways and doors that led to worlds not meant for human eyes. Some called it a portal, others a trap. No one called it safe. Josh leaned over his laptop, scrolling through blurry photos and grainy videos taken by alleged survivors. One video froze on the image of a towering mahogany door. They say this is the threshold. Once you step through, the house decides if it lets you go. Dave chuckled. A house with a god complex. Lovely. Despite his sarcasm, Dave felt the same pull as Josh. Something about the mansion was irresistible. The danger, the mystery. It was the kind of story that could make their fledgling channel explode. They spent hours preparing. Cameras, flashlights, EMF detectors, and enough batteries to power a small city were crammed into their bags. Josh insisted on bringing a notebook, a habit from his investigative journalism days. In case the tech fails, he explained. By the time they loaded their gear into Dave's van, the sun was dipping below the horizon. The mansion's location was pinned on a map app, but the last leg of the journey required directions scribbled in a forum post by someone claiming to have been there. "You're sure about this?" Dave asked, turning the key in the ignition. Josh nodded. "Think about it. If this legend is even half true, we'll have footage no one else has. People are drawn to the unknown. This could be our breakthrough." The drive was uneventful at first, the hum of the engine filling the silence. As they veered onto a dirt road, the forest seemed to swallow them whole. Trees leaned over the path like watchful sentinels, their skeletal branches scratching at the van. "This feels like the setup to every bad horror movie," Dave muttered. Josh didn't respond. His eyes were glued to the GPS, which began to glitch, the dot flickering in and out. "We're close," he murmured. The mansion appeared like a specter, emerging from the dense forest as they rounded a bend. It stood tall and defiant, its windows dark, its facade worn yet imposing. A chill settled over them as they parked. "Well," Dave said, his voice tight. "Welcome to the beginning of the end." Josh grabbed his camera, heart pounding. "Let's see what's waiting for us inside." The mansion loomed over them, its silhouette jagged against the darkening sky. Moonlight spilled through the clouds, illuminating details that made Josh's stomach twist. The windows were empty, yawning voids of blackness. The door, thick and splintered, looked as though it could swallow them whole. Ivy snaked up the sides of the stone walls, clinging like skeletal fingers. Dave exhaled sharply. "Creepy as hell. It's like the house knows we're here." "Perfect for the cameras, though," Josh replied, hoisting the equipment bag onto his shoulder. His attempt at levity fell flat. Even he could feel the oppressive weight of the air. It wasn't just the cold that made him shiver. It was something deeper, a sense that the mansion was alive and watching. The crunch of their boots on the gravel path was the only sound as they approached the door. Josh pulled out his camera and hit record, narrating as he went. "Beyond the Veil Investigations, Case 1. We've arrived at the mansion, rumored to be a gateway to another dimension. Locals refuse to go near it, but tonight, we're going in." Dave shook his head. "You sound like one of those ghost hunting TV hacks." Better to sound like one than end up as one, Josh shot back, testing the door. It groaned loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness. He gave it a push and it swung open, revealing a dimly lit entryway. They stepped inside, the air immediately cooler than outside. Josh swept his flashlight across the room. Dust floated lazily in the beam, and the smell of mildew was overpowering. The grand foyer was strangely pristine despite its age. A massive chandelier hung overhead, its crystals dull and coated in grime. The staircase at the far end was wide and elegant, its banister carved with intricate designs of vines and flowers. "This place is weirdly intact," Dave said, his voice hushed. "Shouldn't it be falling apart by now?" Josh didn't answer. His eyes were drawn to the walls, lined with faded wallpaper in a pattern that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. The effect made his head ache. He turned the camera toward a doorway on the left. "Let's check this out." The room beyond was a parlor, its furniture draped in sheets. A grand piano stood in one corner, the lid open as if waiting to be played. Dave pulled back one of the sheets, revealing a claw-footed chair with upholstery that looked brand new. "Josh," he said, his voice tinged with unease, "this stuff isn't rotting. It's like someone still lives here." Josh's flashlight caught movement in the corner of his eye. He whipped it toward the source, but there was nothing there. Just the shadows cast by their gear. "Did you see that?" he asked. "See what?" Dave replied, already pulling out the EMF detector. "Thought I saw." Josh trailed off, shaking his head. "Never mind." They set up their cameras, placing one in the foyer and another facing the staircase. As Dave adjusted the angle of the second camera, a low creak echoed from above them. Josh froze. "Did you hear that?" Dave turned slowly, his face pale. "Yeah, that wasn't us." Their eyes met, and for the first time, Josh saw real fear in Dave's expression. "Let's just keep going," Josh said, his voice steadier than he felt. They stepped toward the staircase, unaware that the door behind them had silently swung shut. The staircase creaked beneath their boots as they climbed, each step groaning like the house itself was protesting their intrusion. The chandelier above swayed gently, though there wasn't a hint of wind. Josh kept the camera rolling, his flashlight beam flickering across peeling wallpaper and tarnished sconces. "This place is incredible," he whispered, more to himself than to Dave. "It's like it's frozen in time." Dave snorted quietly. If time froze in the middle of a fever dream. At the top of the stairs, the hallway stretched longer than it had appeared from below. Doors lined both sides, their brass knobs dull and smudged. Josh approached the nearest one and hesitated. The air here was different, thicker, heavier, like walking through syrup. His pulse quickened as he reached for the handle. "What do you think is behind it?" Dave asked, breaking the silence. "No idea," Josh replied, gripping the handle and twisting. The door opened with a low groan, revealing a dimly lit room filled with bookshelves. Dust coated the volumes, and cobwebs stretched across the corners of the ceiling. "It's a library," Josh said, stepping inside. His voice echoed faintly, as though the room was larger than it seemed. He moved his flashlight across the spines of the books, noting their worn titles. Histories of the Unseen, Through the Rift, and The Shape of Fear. The titles sent a chill down his spine. Dave followed, glancing nervously at the shadows pooling in the corners. "I don't like this. Feels like something's waiting." Josh ignored him, too focused on a large book lying open on a table in the center of the room. The pages were covered in hand-drawn diagrams of circles, lines, and strange symbols. As he flipped through, the illustrations grew more disturbing. Figures with elongated limbs and hollow eyes, standing in landscapes that defied logic. "Hey, check this out," he said, holding the book up to Dave. But Dave wasn't looking at him. His flashlight was fixed on the doorway they had entered through, now standing closed. "Josh," he said, his voice tight, "did you shut the door?" Josh turned, his stomach lurching. "No, I didn't." They both stared at the door for a long moment. Then Josh moved toward it, camera still rolling. He reached out and twisted the knob. It opened easily, but what lay beyond wasn't the hallway. Instead, the door revealed another staircase, this one spiraling downward into darkness. That's not where we came from," Dave stammered. "Josh, that's not where we came from." Josh's mind raced. He swung the camera around to capture the scene, then turned back to the room. It was no longer a library. The bookshelves were gone, replaced by walls that seemed to stretch and breathe. The table and book had vanished, leaving only the two of them in a suffocating, empty space. "What the hell is going on?" Josh whispered. Before Dave could answer, the door slammed shut on its own, plunging them into darkness. A faint hum vibrated through the air, and Josh's flashlight flickered wildly. The floor beneath them shifted. What had been solid wood now felt uneven, almost spongy. "We need to get out of here," Josh said, his voice trembling. He reached for the door again, but it wouldn't budge. Behind them, the air seemed to ripple, like heat waves rising off pavement. A soft groan, almost human, echoed through the room. Both men froze. And then, without warning, the door flew open, revealing a hallway that neither of them recognized. Josh and Dave stepped cautiously into the new hallway, their flashlights barely piercing the darkness. The air felt wrong here, thicker, colder, as if the walls themselves were alive and pressing in. The sound of their breathing seemed amplified, echoing faintly in a space that defied logic. "This isn't the same hallway," Dave said, his voice a strained whisper. "Where are we?" Josh didn't answer. His flashlight beam caught another door at the end of the hall, different from the others they had seen. It was taller, made of black wood that gleamed unnaturally in the dim light. Intricate carvings adorned its surface, symbols that made Josh's stomach churn the longer he stared at them. "Should we open it?" Dave asked, though he was already inching backward. "We have to," Josh replied, his voice steadier than he felt. "We need to document everything. Whatever's going on here, people need to see it." He raised the camera and moved forward, gripping the strange door's handle. The metal was ice cold, and a jolt of static tingled through his hand as he turned it. The door creaked open, revealing a blinding violet light that forced them both to shield their eyes. When the light dimmed, they saw it. A vast alien landscape stretched out before them. The ground was a deep, shimmering black, reflecting the violet sky above like a mirror. Jagged rock formations jutted out at impossible angles, and strange, spindly plants swayed despite the lack of wind. "What the hell is this?" Dave muttered, stepping forward despite himself. Josh followed, his camera whirring softly as it captured the impossible scene. The air here felt electric, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. In the distance, something moved, a shape too far away to make out but large enough to send a surge of panic through him. "Do you hear that?" Dave asked suddenly, his voice barely audible. Josh strained his ears. At first he heard nothing, then faintly a low droning sound reached them, like a distant guttural chant. It grew louder as they stood there, the vibrations pulsing through the ground beneath their feet. "We need to go," Dave said, his voice rising. "Now!" Josh didn't argue. They turned back to the door, but the sight before them made them both freeze. The door was no longer there. In its place was a jagged rock wall, smooth and featureless. "No, no, no," Josh muttered, spinning around. The violet sky seemed darker now, the shapes in the distance moving closer. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, reaching toward them like fingers. "This way," Dave shouted, grabbing Josh's arm and pulling him toward a narrow path winding through the rocks. The droning sound grew louder, filling their heads with an unbearable pressure. Josh stumbled, his camera slipping from his grip and clattering onto the ground. "Leave it," Dave yelled. Josh hesitated for a fraction of a second before abandoning the camera. They ran, the jagged rocks slicing at their boots. The shadows closed in, the droning morphing into something almost like a voice, alien and incomprehensible, yet somehow beckoning. Ahead, another door appeared, this one glowing faintly. Dave reached it first, throwing it open with desperate force. Josh followed, and as soon as they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them. They were back in the mansion, sprawled on the floor of the hallway. The oppressive air of the alien world was gone, replaced by the suffocating silence of the house. Josh's chest heaved as he looked up at Dave. "What the hell was that?" Dave shook his head, his face pale and drenched in sweat. "I don't know, but I think this house is playing with us." Josh and Dave sat in the hallway, their breaths ragged, and their minds racing to process what they had just experienced. The walls around them felt closer than before. the flickering light of their flashlights casting warped shadows that seemed to dance on their own. "This isn't just a haunted house," Josh said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's something else. It's alive." Dave stared at him, his eyes wide. "If we're not careful, it's going to kill us." They both stood, their movements cautious, as if the floor itself might betray them. The hallway stretched ahead, impossibly long, with doors on either side. Josh felt his stomach churn. The layout had changed again. The way back was gone. "We need to keep moving," he said, gripping his flashlight tighter. "We'll find another way out." As they walked, the mansion seemed to hum with an almost imperceptible energy, its oppressive silence broken by faint groans and creaks. They passed doors that radiated unease, doors with no handles, doors that pulsed as if something alive was trapped behind them. Josh resisted the urge to open one, his instincts screaming that it would be a mistake. Then a sound stopped them both, a voice faint and familiar. "Dave?" Dave froze, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The voice came again, soft and pleading. "Dave, it's me, Mom." Josh turned to his partner, whose face had gone pale. "It's not real," Josh said quickly. "You know it's not real." Dave shook his head, his eyes glistening. "Josh, I know how this sounds, but that's her voice. I'd recognize it anywhere." "It's the house," Josh said firmly, grabbing Dave's shoulder. "It's messing with your head." Before Josh could stop him, Dave broke free and sprinted toward a door at the end of the hall, where the voice had come from. Josh followed, his heart hammering. "Dave, wait!" Dave threw the door open, revealing a dimly lit room. Inside, a figure sat on an old wooden chair, cloaked in shadow. As Dave stepped closer, the figure became clearer. A woman, her face gaunt but unmistakable. "Mom?" Dave choked out, tears streaming down his face. The figure's head tilted slightly, and a grotesque smile spread across her face. "Come closer, sweetheart." Josh grabbed Dave's arm and yanked him back just as the figure's form began to shift, its limbs elongating unnaturally. The woman's face melted into a featureless mass, and her voice turned guttural. "Stay. Stay forever." The room erupted in a piercing wail, and the door slammed shut behind them, throwing them back into the hallway. Dave collapsed to his knees, shaking. "I told you it wasn't real," Josh said, his own voice trembling. Dave nodded, his breathing ragged. It felt so real. As they pressed on, Josh began to feel the mansion's influence seeping into his own thoughts. He saw fleeting visions of wealth and recognition, his wildest dreams seemingly within reach. One door in particular caught his attention. It was slightly ajar, and through the crack he saw stacks of money and awards, with his name etched on them. "You've always wanted this," a voice whispered in his mind. "Just step inside." Josh shook his head violently and stumbled away from the door. He realized then that the mansion was playing a deeper game, weaving their desires and fears into traps meant to ensnare them forever. "Dave," he said, his voice firm, "this place is in our heads. Whatever we see, whatever we hear, we can't trust any of it." Dave nodded weakly, still shaken. "Then how do we fight it?" Josh didn't have an answer. The only certainty was that the mansion was far from done with them. The hallway seemed to stretch forever, its warped angles and flickering shadows bending their sense of reality. Josh and Dave moved cautiously, their flashlights barely cutting through the dense gloom. Every step felt like it brought them deeper into the mansion's clutches. "Do you hear that?" Dave asked, his voice barely audible. Josh paused, straining to listen. There was no sound. No creaking floors, no faint hum. Just an oppressive, suffocating silence. It was worse than noise. "Let's just keep moving," Josh said, trying to sound confident. He wasn't sure how much more of this they could take. They turned a corner and stopped dead in their tracks. The hallway ahead was lined with picture frames, dozens of them, hanging in perfect symmetry. The frames were ornate, their gilded edges glinting faintly in the flashlight beams. "What is this?" Dave asked, stepping closer. His voice trembled. "Why are there pictures here?" Josh felt a chill crawl up his spine. The photos in the frames were crisp, detailed, too modern to belong in this ancient mansion. He peered at one and felt his stomach drop. The photo showed a man standing in a room filled with shelves of old books. The man was Josh. "That's me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Dave moved to the next frame. His hand flew to his mouth as he gasped. "Josh, this one's me." The photo showed Dave sitting at a table, his head in his hands, as if he were in deep despair. The room behind him was unfamiliar, filled with furniture that didn't match anything they'd seen so far. Josh's hands trembled as he shone his flashlight down the hallway, inspecting the other frames. Each photo was of them, caught in moments they had no memory of. In one, Josh was lying face down on a staircase, blood pooling beneath him. In another, Dave was standing in the foyer, staring at the front door with an expression of sheer terror. "This doesn't make sense," Josh muttered, his heart pounding. These can't be real." Dave's flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, Josh thought he saw movement in one of the photos. He stepped closer to a frame, his breath hitching as he studied the image. His own reflection in the photo stared back at him, except it blinked. "Josh!" Dave shouted, yanking him back. "Did you see that? It moved." Josh nodded, his mouth dry. "This isn't just a haunted house, it's showing us something, taunting us." They moved further down the hallway, but the photos grew more disturbing. One showed a door they hadn't yet opened, with a dark figure standing behind it, its face obscured. Another depicted the mansion's foyer, but it was filled with shadowy humanoid shapes, their hollow eyes staring directly at the camera. As they reached the end of the hallway, they came to the largest frame of all. This one showed the two of them standing exactly where they were, in the same hallway, staring at the same photo. But there was a third figure behind them, tall, skeletal, and cloaked in shadow. Josh whirled around, his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Nothing was there. "We need to get out of this hallway," he said, his voice tight. "Now." Dave didn't argue. They broke into a run, the flashlight beams bobbing wildly as they fled. The photos seemed to shift as they passed, the figures in them turning to watch their escape. They reached a new door at the end of the hallway and slammed through it, stumbling into another room. As the door creaked shut behind them, the silence returned, heavy and suffocating. Josh leaned against the wall, his heart racing. "This place, it's alive," Dave said, his voice shaking. "And it's watching us." Josh nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. "We have to keep going, it's the only way out." But deep down, he wondered if the mansion would ever truly let them leave. The room they stumbled into was impossibly large, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into darkness. Dim light came from flickering lanterns that lined the walls, casting erratic shadows across the floor. In the center of the room stood a single wooden table, its surface empty except for a tarnished mirror. Dave hesitated, gripping Josh's arm. "This feels wrong. We shouldn't be here." Josh felt it too, a sense of foreboding that settled deep in his chest. But there was no turning back. The door they had come through was gone. "We don't have a choice," he muttered. "Let's see what this place wants." They approached the table cautiously, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The mirror was oval-shaped, its silver frame intricately carved with symbols Josh couldn't decipher. He glanced at his reflection and froze. The image staring back wasn't him. The version of himself in the mirror looked wrong. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and bloodshot. Dried blood streaked his temple and his lips were cracked and pale. The reflection smirked, a slow, deliberate movement that sent a chill down Josh's spine. "It's not real," Josh whispered, tearing his gaze away. Dave wasn't looking at the mirror. His eyes were fixed on something beyond it, something Josh couldn't see. "Do you hear that?" Dave asked, his voice trembling. Josh shook his head. "There's nothing to hear. It's the house messing with you again." "No," Dave insisted. "It's real. Listen." Josh strained his ears, but the room was silent. He was about to argue when Dave bolted, sprinting toward the far end of the room. "Dave!" Josh shouted, running after him. The lanterns flickered wildly as Dave reached a door that hadn't been there a moment ago. He threw it open and disappeared inside. Josh hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to stop, but he couldn't leave Dave behind. He stepped through the doorway into a space that shouldn't exist. The room was small and claustrophobic, the walls lined with mirrors. Each one reflected a different version of Josh and Dave. Some were grotesque. Josh saw himself covered in burns, his skin blistered and peeling. In another, Dave was grinning maniacally, blood dripping from his hands. "Josh," Dave whispered, his voice trembling, I can't do this." Josh turned to find his friend huddled in a corner, his knees pulled to his chest. "Dave, we need to keep moving. This isn't real, it's just the house trying to scare us." Dave looked up, tears streaming down his face. It's not just scaring us, it's breaking us. Josh knelt beside him, gripping his shoulder. We're stronger than this. Whatever it throws at us, we'll get through it. Together. A sudden noise made them both jump. A deep, resonant thud like a giant heartbeat. The mirrors around them began to shimmer, the reflections rippling as if they were made of water. The sound grew louder, each thud reverberating through their chests. The mirrors began to distort, the images of themselves shifting and writhing. One by one, the reflections turned to face them directly, their hollow eyes boring into their souls. "We need to go," Josh said, pulling Dave to his feet. "Now." They ran toward another door that appeared in the far wall, the sound of the heartbeat growing deafening. The mirrors seemed to shatter as they passed, the shards vanishing into the darkness. They burst through the door and found themselves back in a hallway. The heartbeat stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence. Dave leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. "Josh, this place, it's inside our heads. It knows everything about us." Josh nodded, gripping his flashlight tightly. "That's why we can't let it win. If we give in to fear, we're done." But deep down, he wondered how much longer they could resist. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead of them, dimly lit by flickering sconces that cast jagged shadows on the walls. Josh and Dave moved quickly, their breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The hallway narrowed to a single door, ornate and glowing faintly. Its surface shimmered, the carvings writhing as though alive. Josh hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. "It's another trap," Dave said, his voice trembling. Josh shook his head, steeling himself. "It's our only way out." He pushed the door open and the pounding stopped. The sudden silence was oppressive, as if the mansion itself were holding its breath. Beyond the doorway was a vast circular room, the walls covered in cracked mirrors that distorted their reflections into grotesque caricatures. In the center of the room stood a single object, a tall, ornate mirror, its surface dark and rippling like liquid. The air felt heavy, charged with an energy that made Josh's skin crawl. "This has to be the center of it all," he said, stepping forward cautiously. Dave grabbed his arm. "Josh, look." Josh followed his gaze to the mirrors lining the walls. Their reflections weren't mimicking their movements. Instead, they were watching. Faces turned slightly, eyes following their every step. One of the reflections grinned, a wide, unnatural smile that sent a chill down Josh's spine. "This place wants to break us," Josh muttered. "We can't let it." The tall mirror in the center began to ripple, its surface distorting as something moved within it. Josh stepped closer, raising his flashlight. The light didn't reflect back. Instead, the mirror absorbed it, growing darker with each passing second. "Don't go near it," Dave warned, backing away. But it was too late. The mirror's surface exploded outward and a figure stepped through. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs too long, its face smooth and featureless except for a gaping mouth that stretched impossibly wide. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like a marionette controlled by an unseen hand. Josh and Dave stumbled back, the creature advancing on them with inhuman speed. "Run!" Josh shouted. But the room shifted again, the walls closing in, trapping them with the thing. The reflections in the mirrors began to change, showing scenes of their worst fears. Josh saw himself lying lifeless in a pool of blood, while Dave's reflection screamed silently, clawing at his own face. The images burned into their minds, threatening to overwhelm them. The creature lunged, its movements faster than they could comprehend. Josh grabbed a shard of glass from one of the cracked mirrors, slashing at the thing as it closed in. The shard connected, and the creature shrieked, a sound that rattled the very foundations of the mansion. The mirrors around the room shattered, and the air filled with swirling glass and light. Josh grabbed Dave's arm, dragging him toward a new doorway that had appeared in the chaos. "This is our chance," he shouted. They bolted through the door, the creature's wails echoing behind them. The mansion seemed to collapse around them, the walls twisting and folding in on themselves. Every step felt like a fight against gravity as the floor tilted wildly. Ahead, they saw the foyer, the first familiar sight since they'd entered. The front door stood open, moonlight spilling inside. "We're almost there," Josh yelled. They sprinted toward the exit, the mansion's fury chasing them. Just as they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them with a thunderous finality. Josh and Dave collapsed onto the overgrown lawn outside the mansion, gasping for air. The night was eerily quiet, the oppressive weight of the house gone. The moon hung low in the sky, bathing the forest in a cold, pale glow. Josh turned back toward the mansion, half expecting it to vanish or shift into something unrecognizable. Instead, it stood silently, its dark windows staring back at him like empty eye sockets. Did we actually make it out?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Dave nodded, clutching his knees as he tried to steady his breathing. "I don't know how, but yeah, we're out." Josh reached for the camera strapped to his chest. Miraculously, it was still intact, though he doubted it had captured anything useful. The memory cards were likely corrupted. Just another cruel joke from the house. "We need to check the footage," he said, more to himself than to Dave. They sat in the van a few minutes later, unwilling to linger near the mansion any longer. Josh plugged the camera into his laptop, his hand shaking. The screen lit up, but the files were a mess, glitching and skipping, the images distorted beyond recognition. Every so often a clear frame would appear, the distorted mirrors, the infinite hallways, the monstrous figure. "It's enough," Josh said, his voice resolute. "It's proof that something's there." Dave leaned back in his seat, staring blankly out the window. Proof of what? That we're insane? That we almost got killed in a house that shouldn't exist? Josh met his gaze, his expression firm. Proof that we were right to start this. People need to know what's out there. If this is what we found on our first case, imagine what else is waiting. Dave didn't respond immediately. He stared out at the mansion, now just a dark silhouette against the trees. Finally, he said, "We barely made it out alive. What happens next time?" Josh's lips curved into a grim smile. "We'll be ready." They drove back to their office in silence, the weight of their experience settling over them like a heavy fog. By the time they arrived, dawn was breaking, casting a warm glow over the town. It felt surreal, as though they'd been gone for days rather than hours. Josh uploaded their story online, pairing the corrupted footage with their detailed account of the night. The response was immediate. Comments flooded in, ranging from skepticism to awe. Some praised their bravery, while others accused them of fabricating the entire thing. It didn't matter. For Josh and Dave, this was just the beginning. The mansion had tested them, pushed them to their limits, but it hadn't broken them. As they packed their equipment for their next investigation, Josh glanced at Dave. "You still in?" Dave hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I'm in, but let's hope the next place doesn't try to eat us alive." Josh chuckled, though there was little humor in it. "No promises." They loaded their gear into the van, the lingering fear replaced by a burning determination. Beyond the Veil, Investigations wasn't just a name anymore, it was a mission. The mansion might have let them go, but it wasn't a victory. The scars it left would stay with them, reminders of what lay beyond the veil. And for Josh and Dave, the veil was only just beginning to lift. Hey Reddit, I've got a story to share that's been haunting me for weeks now. I'm not even sure why I'm writing this, maybe to get it off my chest, maybe to warn someone, or maybe just to see if anyone else has had a similar experience. I'm 26, and when I'm not driving for Uber, I've got this strange hobby of diving into the dark web. Yeah, I know it sounds cliche and stupid, but there's something about the anonymity and the sheer mystery of it that keeps drawing me back. It's like exploring a forbidden library, where each book is a glimpse into the most hidden corners of the human psyche. It all started a few years ago when I was introduced to the concept by a friend. He showed me how to access it using Tor, and I was hooked. Most of the time, it's just a bunch of weird forums, marketplaces selling God knows what, and conspiracy theory websites. I never buy anything or interact much. I'm more of an observer. I know there are risks, but I've always been careful, or at least I thought I was. A typical night for me after a long shift driving people around is to come home, grab a beer, and fire up my laptop. The dark web is like my late-night TV. It's my way to unwind. I know it sounds twisted, but there's something about the dark underbelly of the internet that fascinates me. You see the worst and the weirdest of humanity, but also the most hidden truths, or at least what some people claim to be truths. One night, after a particularly grueling day, I decided to do my usual routine. The rides were relentless, filled with drunk partygoers, awkward conversations, and the never-ending smell of fast food lingering in my car. By the time I got home, I was exhausted. I cracked open a cold one, fired up my laptop, and went deeper into the web than I usually do. I wasn't looking for anything specific, just surfing, clicking random links, and seeing where they took me. About half an hour in, I stumbled upon a blog that stood out. It was different from the usual conspiracy junk and scammy-looking sites. The design was simplistic, almost clinical, and the title was in bold red letters: Project Lucid, the military's darkest secret. My curiosity piqued instantly. I had heard rumors about the military experimenting with all sorts of bizarre stuff, but lucid dreaming? This was new. The blog claimed to be an insider's account of a classified military project focused on lucid dreaming. I should have clicked away right then, but I didn't. Instead, I started reading, and what I found was more disturbing than anything I had ever come across on the dark web before. The story was detailed, filled with jargon and references to military protocols that seemed legitimate. It wasn't like your typical poorly written creepypasta. This felt real. Too real. The author, who claimed to be an ex-military scientist, wrote about how the project started with noble intentions. They wanted to enhance soldiers' training through controlled dreaming. Imagine learning combat techniques in your sleep, perfecting strategies without the physical strain. It sounded incredible, almost too good to be true. But as I read on, the tone shifted from scientific curiosity to something much darker and more sinister. The deeper I got into the blog, the more unsettling the details became. There were mentions of psychological breakdowns, unexplained disappearances, and even deaths. The project, codenamed Dreamscape, had apparently gone off the rails, leading to horrifying consequences for those involved. I was hooked and horrified, unable to stop reading. That night marked the beginning of a rabbit hole I wish I had never gone down. Each entry in the blog was more chilling than the last, filled with descriptions of experiments that sounded like something out of a horror movie. But it wasn't just the content that got to me. It was the way it was written. The author's fear and paranoia seeped through every word, making it hard to dismiss as mere fiction. I'll share more in the next parts, but for now, I need a break. Just thinking about it gives me chills. If you're into this sort of stuff, stick around. There's a lot more to this story, and it only gets darker from here. After a long day of driving for Uber, dealing with the usual mix of passengers and the constant drone of the city, I was more than ready to unwind. My car reeked of stale fast food and spilled drinks, and my nerves were frayed from the ceaseless small talk. By the time I got home, it was nearly midnight. I sank into my worn-out couch, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and powered up my laptop. It was time for my usual ritual of dark web exploration. Scrolling through the dark web has always been a peculiar solace for me. It's like sifting through a twisted digital archive of humanity's most secret and bizarre obsessions. That night, I wasn't looking for anything specific, just the usual thrill of the unknown. I clicked through various links, each one taking me deeper into the abyss. The clock ticked past 1 a.m. as I ventured further into the shadowy corners of the internet. About 30 minutes into my browsing, I stumbled upon something that immediately grabbed my attention. The link was buried within a forum dedicated to conspiracy theories. It was unassuming, just a simple text hyperlink that read, Project Lucid, the military's darkest secret. The name alone sent a shiver down my spine. I clicked on it without hesitation. The page that loaded was stark and minimalist, almost sterile. The title was emblazoned across the top in bold red letters. Beneath it was a series of blog entries, each one meticulously dated and detailed. As I started reading, I realized this wasn't just another conspiracy theory. The writing was precise, filled with technical terms and references that felt disturbingly authentic. The first entry introduced the project, codenamed Dreamscape, and outlined its goals. The military had been experimenting with lucid dreaming, hoping to create a new form of training for soldiers. The idea was to use lucid dreams as a way to perfect combat techniques, strategies, and even language skills, all within the safety of one's own mind. It sounded revolutionary, almost too good to be true, and as with anything that sounds too good to be true, there was a dark side. The blog's author, who claimed to be an ex-military scientist, described how the project started with high hopes and rigorous scientific protocols. The initial tests showed promising results. Soldiers were able to achieve lucid dreaming states more reliably, and their dream-based training seemed to translate into real-world skills. But it wasn't long before things began to unravel. The deeper I delved into the blog, the more unsettling the details became. The lucid dreaming experiments were not without their side effects. Soldiers reported experiencing intense nightmares, sleep paralysis, and disturbing hallucinations. Some even started to lose their grip on reality, unable to distinguish between their dreams and waking life. The line between the two blurred in the most terrifying ways. One entry described a soldier who had been a star subject in the early phases of the project. He was able to control his dreams with remarkable precision, mastering complex maneuvers and combat techniques. But then he began to suffer from vivid, recurring nightmares. He claimed that in his dreams, he was being hunted by shadowy figures, faceless and relentless. The nightmares grew worse, invading his waking hours. He became paranoid, convinced that the figures were following him in real life. His mental state deteriorated rapidly, and he was eventually discharged from the project. The blog hinted that he had disappeared shortly after. I was hooked, unable to tear my eyes away from the screen. Each entry painted a picture of a project spiraling out of control, with increasingly dire consequences for the soldiers involved. The author's tone grew more frantic with each post, his fear palpable through the words. He detailed how the project leaders ignored the warning signs, pushing forward in their quest for success. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread settling over me. The more I read, the more I felt like I was being watched, like the shadows in my room were growing darker and more oppressive. The words on the screen seemed to pulse with a life of their own, dragging me deeper into the nightmare that was Project Lucid. I finally forced myself to stop reading around 3 a.m. My heart was racing and my hands were trembling. I closed my laptop, but the images and words from the blog lingered in my mind. I tried to sleep, but my dreams were haunted by faceless figures and endless dark corridors. It was as if the blog had infected my subconscious, planting seeds of fear that took root and grew in the fertile soil of my imagination. Despite the unease that had settled in my mind, I couldn't resist diving back into the blog the next evening. There was something about the story that compelled me to continue, like a moth drawn to a flame. I opened my laptop, navigated back to the dark web, and found the blog again. I resumed reading, eager and anxious to uncover what happened next in Project Lucid. The entries that followed delved deeper into the methods used by the military to induce lucid dreaming. According to the author, the researchers had developed a special medicine, a cocktail of substances designed to enhance the brain's ability to achieve and maintain a lucid dreaming state. The concoction was a closely guarded secret, its exact composition known only to a handful of top scientists within the project. The initial results were promising. Soldiers who took the medicine reported a significant increase in their ability to control their dreams. They could manipulate the dream environment, practice complex tasks, and even simulate combat scenarios with startling clarity. It was like having a virtual reality training program inside their heads. The military was thrilled with the progress, seeing limitless potential in this new form of training. However, the blog also detailed the darker side of these experiments. While the medicine enhanced lucid dreaming, it also had unforeseen side effects. Some soldiers began to experience prolonged episodes of sleep paralysis, a condition where they were awake but unable to move, often accompanied by terrifying hallucinations. They described feeling a heavy weight on their chest, as if someone or something was sitting on them, watching them with unseen eyes. Other soldiers reported vivid, almost lifelike nightmares. These dreams were so intense that they left psychological scars, blurring the line between reality and the dream world. One entry told the story of a soldier named Mark, who had been an exemplary participant in the early phases of the project. Mark's lucid dreams were so clear and controlled that he became the poster child for Project Lucid's success. But then, things took a turn for the worse. Mark began to dream about a dark, endless forest. No matter what he did, he couldn't escape it. Every night, he found himself wandering through the twisted trees, hearing whispers and seeing fleeting shadows just beyond his field of vision. The dreams became increasingly distressing, leaving him exhausted and paranoid during the day. He confided in his fellow soldiers and the project's scientists, but they dismissed his fears as mere side effects of the medicine. Mark's condition deteriorated rapidly. He started to confuse his dreams with reality, waking up screaming and disoriented, convinced that the shadows from his dreams had followed him into the waking world. Despite his pleas, the project leaders continued to administer the medicine, determined to push forward. One night, Mark didn't wake up. The blog post hinted at his fate, suggesting that he had slipped into a coma, lost somewhere between the dream world and reality. Reading about Mark sent chills down my spine. The blog entries became more frantic, with the author describing how more and more soldiers were succumbing to similar fates. The medicine that had once been hailed as a breakthrough was now seen as a curse, trapping its users in a nightmarish limbo. The project was spiraling out of control, and the scientists were at a loss, unable to reverse the damage they had caused. The author's desperation was palpable. He recounted how he had tried to warn his superiors to shut down the project before more lives were ruined. But his warnings fell on deaf ears. The military was too invested in the potential benefits to acknowledge the growing body count. The blog ended abruptly, with the author hinting that he was being watched and that his life might be in danger for revealing these secrets. I closed my laptop, feeling a heavy weight settle in my chest. The story was too bizarre, too horrifying to be true, yet it was written with such conviction and detail that I couldn't dismiss it outright. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was some kernel of truth buried in the madness, and I knew I had to keep digging to find out what really happened to the soldiers of Project Lucid. The next night, I found myself unable to resist the pull of the blog. Despite the growing dread that gnawed at my insides, I had to know more. I fired up my laptop, navigating back to the dark web, and resumed reading the entries of Project Lucid. This time, the focus shifted to an even more unsettling aspect of the experiments: astral projection. According to the blog, the military's foray into lucid dreaming had inadvertently opened a doorway to this phenomenon. For the uninitiated, astral projection is the supposed ability to consciously leave one's physical body and travel in a spirit form, exploring the world, or even other realms. At first, the project's leaders were thrilled. They saw astral projection as the ultimate espionage tool. Imagine being able to gather intelligence without ever leaving the safety of a secure facility. Soldiers trained in lucid dreaming began to report experiences where they felt themselves floating above their bodies, able to move freely through space and even pass through walls. The military was eager to harness this newfound ability. The blog described in chilling detail how soldiers were encouraged to explore their astral selves. They were given specific targets to observe and report back on. Initially, the results were astonishing. Soldiers returned with detailed descriptions of far-off places, conversations overheard, and layouts of enemy compounds, all seemingly verified by subsequent intelligence. But as with the earlier phases of the project, the success was short-lived. The author recounted how soldiers started to encounter strange, malevolent entities during their astral travels. These entities, described as shadowy figures or dark presences, seemed to be aware of the soldiers' intrusions into their realm. Encounters with these beings often left the soldiers deeply shaken, their mental states deteriorating rapidly. One particularly harrowing entry detailed the experience of a soldier named Tom. Tom had been one of the project's most successful subjects, mastering lucid dreaming and astral projection with ease. One night he was tasked with observing a remote military installation. During his astral journey, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if he were being watched. Suddenly, he was confronted by a towering shadow figure, its form shifting and roiling like smoke. The figure reached out, and Tom felt a searing pain that jolted him back to his physical body. Tom awoke screaming, clutching his chest. He described the encounter in vivid detail, convinced that the shadow figure had followed him back. From that night on, Tom was plagued by horrific nightmares and waking hallucinations. He saw the shadow figure everywhere, in mirrors, in the corners of his room, even reflected in the eyes of his comrades. His health declined rapidly, and within weeks he slipped into a coma from which he never awoke. The blog was filled with similar accounts. Soldiers who had once been confident and composed were reduced to fearful shells of their former selves. Many of them experienced vivid, recurring nightmares where they were pursued by the shadow figures. Some described feeling a constant oppressive presence, as if they were never truly alone. The most disturbing part was that a significant number of these soldiers never woke up again. They remained in a comatose state, their minds seemingly trapped in the astral realm. The author of the blog was growing increasingly frantic. He described how the project's leaders continued to downplay the dangers, pushing forward with their experiments despite the mounting casualties. The medicine, once seen as a gateway to new possibilities, was now a harbinger of doom, opening doors to places that humans were never meant to explore. As I read, a cold fear settled over me. The story was spiraling into madness, yet it was written with such conviction and detail that it was hard to dismiss. The idea that these soldiers were trapped in their own minds, pursued by malevolent entities, was terrifying. The notion that the military had willingly continued these experiments despite the obvious dangers was even more chilling. The blog ended with a dire warning. The author pleaded with readers to stay away from the medicine, from the idea of lucid dreaming for military purposes. He warned that the dark web was full of secrets that were never meant to be uncovered, and that some doors, once opened, could never be closed. I closed my laptop, my mind racing. The story had taken a turn into the truly horrifying, and I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it than just a wild conspiracy theory. The dark web was a place where anyone could post anything, but this felt different. The fear and desperation in the author's words were too real to ignore. I woke up the next morning feeling a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. The story I had read haunted my thoughts, casting a dark shadow over everything I did. The blog had left me with more questions than answers, and I felt an overwhelming urge to dig deeper, to find out if there was any truth to the terrifying claims made by the author. Over the next few days, I scoured the dark web for any additional information on Project Lucid. I visited forums, read through countless conspiracy theories, and even reached out to a few contacts who were more knowledgeable about the murkier parts of the internet. Most of what I found was the usual mix of paranoia and fantasy, but there were a few threads that seemed to corroborate parts of the blog's story. One forum post, buried deep within a thread on military experiments, mentioned a project that sounded eerily similar to Dreamscape. The poster claimed to be a former soldier who had heard rumors about a top-secret program involving lucid dreaming and mind control. He spoke of comrades who had mysteriously disappeared and strange medical treatments that left participants changed in unsettling ways. While it wasn't definitive proof, it was enough to keep me hooked. I began to piece together a picture of what might have happened. The military, always on the lookout for new ways to gain an edge, had stumbled upon the potential of lucid dreaming. They had pushed the boundaries of what was possible, using a combination of drugs and psychological conditioning to enhance their soldiers' abilities. But in their quest for superiority, they had opened doors that were better left closed, doors that led to dark and dangerous places. The more I read, the more I began to realize that the truth might never be fully known. The dark web is a place where reality and fiction blend seamlessly, where anyone can post anything, and where the most outlandish stories can sometimes have a kernel of truth. It was entirely possible that Project Lucid was a fabrication, a complex and detailed work of fiction designed to entertain and scare. But it was also possible that it was real, that the military had indeed dabbled in areas that were beyond their understanding, with horrifying consequences. As I reflected on everything I had learned, I felt the need to share a disclaimer, both for myself and anyone else who might stumble upon the story. The dark web is a treacherous place, filled with misinformation and danger. It's easy to get lost in the shadows, to believe in the most terrifying tales, but it's crucial to remember that not everything you read is true. Conspiracy theories can be compelling, but they are often just that, theories. In the end, I decided to take a step back from the dark web. The story of Project Lucid had shaken me deeply, making me question my own fascination with the hidden and the unknown. I realized that some things are better left undiscovered, some doors better left unopened. The dark web had shown me a glimpse of a world that was both fascinating and frightening, and I wasn't sure I wanted to venture any further into its depths. To anyone reading this, I urge caution. The internet is a vast and mysterious place, and the dark web is its most enigmatic and dangerous part. Whether Project Lucid is real or not, the fear it inspired in me was very real. Sometimes it's better to let the shadows remain shadows and to find peace in the light of day. As for me, I've gone back to my regular life, driving for Uber and trying to forget the horrors I read about. But every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I can't help but think about the soldiers who might still be out there, trapped in their dreams, hunted by shadows. Also now I am scared to try to lucid dream. I was trying to do it as well. I mean, no medications or whatever, but I really wanted to control my dreams. And of astral projection, I don't know if that thing is real, but it really scares me now. Before I finish, I have to mention this one more time. This is all just a conspiracy theory until it is proven. Anyone can write stuff like this. Viewer discretion is advised, or in this case, listener, I guess. Okay, enough from me. Thanks for listening. I've always been a curious person, the kind who gets lost in Wikipedia spirals at 3 a.m., digging through article after article about random, obscure topics. But it wasn't until I stumbled upon the dark web that I realized just how deep the rabbit hole could go. Now, before you judge, let me clarify. I wasn't looking for anything illegal or disturbing. My interest was purely academic, a quest for knowledge about the hidden corners of the internet that you won't find on Google. It all started one evening after work. I had been reading about various conspiracy theories on a popular forum, and one user mentioned the dark web as a place where the real conspiracies were discussed. Intrigued, I decided to explore. I had heard about Tor and how it could be used to access the dark web, so I downloaded it and began my journey. The first thing that struck me was how different the dark web was from the surface web. It was eerily quiet, with simple text-based websites and forums. No flashy ads or autoplay videos, just raw information. It felt like I had stepped into a forgotten library, one where the books were written in whispers. I spent hours sifting through various forums and websites, most of which were pretty mundane. There were marketplaces selling questionable goods, sure, but I steered clear of those. My goal was to find the hidden knowledge, the kind of stuff that would never make it to mainstream news. Eventually, I found a forum dedicated to conspiracy theories. This wasn't your typical fake moon landing or flat earth nonsense. These were detailed, well-researched posts about government experiments, hidden technologies, and secret societies. The users were anonymous, but they wrote with a conviction that was both compelling and unnerving. One night, I stumbled upon a thread titled, Project Telekinesis, the government's best-kept secret. The post was lengthy and meticulously detailed, claiming to reveal a top-secret government experiment from the 1960s aimed at training people to develop telekinetic abilities. It sounded like something out of a science fiction novel, but the way it was written made it hard to dismiss outright. The author of the post, who went by the handle Watcher39, claimed to have uncovered declassified documents and first-hand accounts from individuals involved in the project. They described a facility hidden in the remote forests of Montana, where volunteers were subjected to rigorous training regimens designed to unlock the hidden potential of the human mind. I couldn't help but feel a chill run down my spine as I read through the details. It wasn't just the content of the post that was disturbing, but the possibility that there might be a kernel of truth to it. After all, history is replete with examples of government experiments that sound unbelievable, but turned out to be real. MK Ultra, anyone? Despite the creeping sense of unease, I was hooked. I needed to know more. Who were these volunteers? What kind of training did they undergo? And most importantly, what were the outcomes of the project? Over the next few days, I dove deeper into the forum, piecing together bits of information from various threads and users. The more I learned, the more unsettling the story became. The idea that the government might have been dabbling in something as fantastical as telekinesis was both thrilling and terrifying. Looking back, I realize how easily curiosity can lead you down paths you never intended to tread. What started as an innocent quest for knowledge was quickly turning into an obsession. My fascination with Project Telekinesis grew each day. The more I delved into the dark web forum, the more pieces of the puzzle I began to uncover. One evening, as I scrolled through the countless threads, I found a post by someone named P.21. Their post promised to reveal previously hidden details about the telekinesis research from the 1960s. My heart raced as I clicked on the link. The post began with a brief introduction about the origins of the project. According to P.21, it all started during the Cold War era, when the U.S. government was desperately searching for ways to gain an edge over the Soviet Union. The project was known officially as MK Ultra Subproject 69, a name that sent shivers down my spine. If even a fraction of what was written here was true, it meant that this was a part of the infamous MK Ultra experiments that involved mind control and psychological manipulation. P.21 provided a detailed account of how the project began. It was spearheaded by a shadowy government agency known as the Division, which specialized in unconventional warfare and psychological experiments. They recruited a team of scientists, psychologists, and military personnel to conduct the research. The goal was to harness the power of the human mind to manipulate objects without physical interaction, telekinesis. The forum post included excerpts from what were claimed to be declassified documents, although their authenticity was impossible to verify. One document, dated 1963, described the initial recruitment phase. Volunteers were sought from various backgrounds, military, civilian, even from psychiatric hospitals. They were promised substantial financial compensation and the opportunity to be part of a groundbreaking experiment. As I read on, I discovered that the recruitment process was highly selective. Candidates underwent rigorous psychological evaluations, physical exams, and background checks. Those who passed were taken to a remote facility in Montana, far from prying eyes. The facility was designed to be self-sufficient and completely isolated, ensuring that no information could leak out. The post included a grainy black and white photograph of the facility. It looked like a large, nondescript building surrounded by dense forest. The picture alone was enough to send a chill down my spine. It was eerie to think that such a place might have existed, hidden away from the world, conducting experiments that bordered on the fantastical. Once the volunteers arrived at the facility, they were stripped of their personal belongings and assigned numbers instead of names. This dehumanization was meant to break down their identities, and make them more susceptible to the training. They were housed in small white rooms that were completely soundproof and devoid of any distractions. The isolation was intense, designed to force the mind to focus inward. Deep Dive 22 described the training regimen in excruciating detail. The volunteers were made to stare at objects placed on a pedestal in the center of their rooms. They were instructed to clear their minds and visualize the objects moving solely through the power of their thoughts. The sessions lasted for hours each day, and the volunteers were subjected to continuous observation by unseen handlers. To aid in their focus, the volunteers were given a drug referred to only as Compound X. The post was vague about the nature of this substance, but it was described as a powerful psychotropic designed to enhance mental concentration and reduce physical fatigue. The side effects, however, were severe: hallucinations, paranoia, and in some cases, complete mental breakdown. Reading this, I felt a knot form in my stomach. The idea of people being subjected to such extreme conditions, all in the name of scientific discovery, was deeply unsettling. Yet I couldn't tear myself away from the story. It was like watching a car crash in slow motion, horrifying, but impossible to look away from. The post concluded with a tantalizing hint that there was more to come. Deep Dive 22 promised to reveal the outcomes of the project in their next post, including the fate of the volunteers and whether any of them had actually developed telekinetic abilities. My obsession with Project Telekinesis grew stronger with each passing day. I eagerly awaited the next post from Deep Dive 22, hoping to uncover more about this mysterious and chilling experiment. Finally, the update arrived, shedding light on the unusual training process the volunteers endured. The training was as intense as it was strange. According to the latest post, the volunteers were completely isolated from one another, each confined to their own stark, white room. These rooms were designed to be sensory deprivation chambers. The walls, floors, and ceilings were padded to eliminate any noise, and the lighting was a harsh, continuous white that left no room for shadows or respite. The volunteers had no concept of time. Days and nights blended into one continuous, disorienting blur. Their only contact with the outside world was through a small, unmarked door where their meals were delivered. Meals consisted of a bland, nutrient-dense paste designed to sustain their physical health while providing no sensory pleasure. The lack of taste, smell, and texture further heightened their sensory deprivation, forcing their minds to turn inward. In the center of each room stood a single pedestal upon which rested various objects: a pencil, a small rubber ball, a feather. The volunteers were instructed to focus on these objects, visualizing them moving through sheer force of will. The constant staring, combined with the isolation and deprivation, was intended to break down their mental barriers and unlock latent psychic abilities. The regimen was relentless. Each day, the volunteers were required to undergo hours of intense mental focus exercises. They were instructed to imagine the objects lifting, spinning, or floating. Their progress was meticulously monitored by scientists through hidden cameras and sensors embedded in the room. Compound X played a crucial role in this process. Administered daily, it was a blend of substances designed to heighten mental acuity and focus. The exact composition of the drug remained a mystery, but its effects were undeniable. Volunteers reported vivid dreams and heightened perception. Some even claimed to sense movements or changes in the objects in their rooms. Despite the rigorous training and the effects of Compound X, progress was slow. The majority of volunteers showed no signs of developing telekinetic abilities. The strain on their minds and bodies was immense. Many began to suffer from severe psychological distress, exhibiting symptoms of acute anxiety and depression. Some became withdrawn, others seemed lost in their own thoughts, and a few stared blankly at the objects before them without any sign of recognition or response. The post included excerpts from the journal of Dr. Evelyn Cartwright, one of the lead scientists on the project. Her entries revealed a growing sense of frustration and desperation. June 14, 1964. The subjects are not responding as expected. Their mental fortitude is breaking down faster than anticipated. Compound X shows promise, but the side effects are severe. We must push forward. Failure is not an option. As I read her words, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for both the volunteers and the scientists. They were all trapped in a challenging situation, driven by ambition, curiosity, and a relentless pursuit of the unknown. The post concluded with a revelation. Despite the overwhelming failure rate, one volunteer began to show promise. Identified only as Subject 23, this individual exhibited subtle but undeniable signs of telekinetic ability. Objects would shift slightly on the pedestal, and there were instances of the rubber ball levitating a few inches off the ground. The scientists were elated, believing they had finally found a breakthrough. But the price of this progress was high. Subject 23's mental state showed signs of strain. They became increasingly agitated and withdrawn. Their journal entries, included in the post, were a jumble of disjointed thoughts, fears, and dreams. July 2nd, 1964. It's happening. I can feel it. The ball moved. But they're watching me. I can't trust them. I can't trust anyone. The voices won't stop. Make them stop, please. Reading these entries, I felt a deep sense of unease. This wasn't just a story about a failed experiment. It was a glimpse into the challenges that can arise when pushing the boundaries of human potential. The anticipation for Deep Dive 22's next post was palpable. Each day I checked the forum, waiting for new insights into the fate of the volunteers in Project Telekinesis. When the update finally appeared, it was even more disturbing than I had imagined. According to Deep Dive 22, the final phase of the experiment took a tragic turn. The prolonged isolation, intense mental exercises, and the effects of Compound X began to take a heavy toll on the volunteers. Their mental states deteriorated rapidly, leading to severe psychological issues. The once hopeful and curious individuals became shadows of their former selves. Dr. Cartwright's journal entries became increasingly bleak. August 5th, 1964. The strain is too much for most of the subjects. Many have stopped responding altogether. They sit in their rooms, motionless, their eyes vacant. It's as if their minds have shut down completely. We are losing them. August 12th, 1964. Subject 23 is the only one showing signs of progress, but at what cost? The agitation is worsening. Subject 23 has become volatile and unpredictable. The telekinetic abilities are undeniable, but the psychological toll is severe. Deep Dive 22 described how the volunteers, one by one, fell into states of complete mental shutdown. They stopped talking, moving, or showing any emotion. It was as if their minds had simply given up, unable to cope with the relentless pressure and isolation. The scientists were at a loss. The project that had promised so much had instead resulted in a profound tragedy, except for one. Subject 23, despite the severe psychological strain, had managed to develop telekinetic abilities. The post included detailed accounts of small objects moving under Subject 23's focus. A pencil rolling across a table, a feather floating mid-air. These were not just random occurrences, but deliberate actions controlled by the mind. The scientists were both thrilled and horrified by this development. However, the success came at a steep price. Subject 23's journal entries revealed a person on the brink of madness, struggling to distinguish between reality and the hallucinations induced by Compound X. August 20th, 1964. I moved it again today. The pencil. It rolled across the table. I should be happy, but I can't shake the feeling that they're watching me. They whisper when I close my eyes. I can't sleep. I can't think. Why won't they stop? August 28th, 1964. I made the feather float today. It was beautiful, like a dream. But the voices are louder now. They tell me things, horrible things. I don't know what's real anymore. I'm scared. I just wanted to stop. As I read these entries, a chill ran down my spine. The idea of unlocking such a power only to lose one's sanity in the process was deeply unsettling. It was a stark reminder of the potential dangers of pushing the human mind beyond its limits. Deep Dive 22's post concluded with a grim statement. All but one of the volunteers ended up in permanent catatonia, their minds unable to cope with the strain. Subject 23 was the only one to achieve telekinesis, but at the cost of their mental stability. The project was deemed a failure and subsequently buried, the records sealed away from the public eye. The story of Project Telekinesis was both fascinating and horrifying. It painted a picture of human ambition taken to extreme lengths, with disastrous consequences. Despite the incredible achievement of telekinesis, the human cost was too high to justify the means. The story of Project Telekinesis had consumed my thoughts for weeks. I couldn't shake the images and stories from my mind, and I found myself discussing it with friends and family, trying to make sense of what I had uncovered. The consensus was clear. Whether true or not, it was a grim reminder of how far human curiosity and ambition could push ethical boundaries. Deep Dive 22's final post on the forum provided a sobering conclusion. It was an attempt to ground the story back in reality, reminding readers that while the details were compelling, they were still part of a conspiracy theory. No concrete proof had ever been provided, and many of the documents and accounts could easily have been fabricated or exaggerated. The post started with a disclaimer. Disclaimer: the following account is based on unverified sources and should be considered a conspiracy theory. While elements of the story are intriguing, readers are advised to approach it with a critical mind and not take it as factual history. Deep Dive 22 elaborated on the aftermath of the project. According to the final post, the facility in Montana was eventually abandoned. Officially, the project was never acknowledged, and all records were classified or destroyed. The surviving scientists and personnel were reassigned to other, more mundane tasks, and the volunteers were quietly institutionalized, their families compensated for their silence. Subject 23, the only successful telekinetic, remained an enigma. The post claimed that they were taken to a separate facility for further study, but all subsequent records were either lost or heavily redacted. Some believe that Subject 23 continued to refine their abilities, possibly being used in covert operations, while others speculate that their mental state deteriorated to the point where they could no longer function. As much as the story intrigued me, I knew I had to take it with a grain of salt. The internet, especially the dark web, is rife with tales that blur the line between reality and fiction. It's easy to get swept up in the narrative, but without concrete evidence, it's all speculation. Reflecting on everything I had read, I couldn't help but feel a mix of awe and sadness. The idea that humans could potentially unlock such extraordinary abilities was thrilling, but the ethical implications and human cost were deeply troubling. If there was even a shred of truth to the story, it served as a stark warning about the dangers of unchecked scientific experimentation. I decided to step back from my exploration of the dark web for a while. The journey had been fascinating, but it had also taken a toll on my peace of mind. I returned to my usual browsing habits, diving into less disturbing topics and reconnecting with the more mundane aspects of life. Occasionally, I would revisit the forum, reading new posts and updates, but none captivated me quite like Project Telekinesis. It remained a haunting tale at the back of my mind, a reminder of the dark corners of human ambition and the potential consequences of pushing the boundaries of what we know. In the end, whether true or not, the story of Project Telekinesis left me with a deeper appreciation for the ethical considerations that must accompany scientific discovery. It's not just about what we can achieve, but also about the impact on those who are part of that journey. The pursuit of knowledge is noble, but it must always be balanced with compassion and respect for the human spirit. As I closed my laptop one final time on the topic, I took a deep breath and let go of the lingering unease. The dark web held many secrets, but it also taught me the importance of seeking truth with a critical eye and a cautious heart. Hey Reddit, this is going to be a long and pretty disturbing story, but I feel like I need to get it off my chest. It all started when I was 19 years old. I was a freshman in college, juggling classes and a part-time job at a local coffee shop. Like many students, I was perpetually broke, scraping by on a meager paycheck and whatever financial aid I could scrounge up. My parents weren't exactly rolling in dough either, so asking them for help was out of the question. Living on my own for the first time, I quickly realized how expensive life could be. Rent, utilities, textbooks, food, it all added up so quickly. There were times when I'd skip meals just to save a few bucks, and the constant stress of financial instability weighed heavily on me. My nights were often sleepless, spent worrying about how I was going to make it through another month. My apartment was a dingy little place in a not-so-great part of town. The walls were thin, and I could hear my neighbors' arguments, the incessant crying of a baby next door, and the occasional scuffle outside. The paint was peeling, and there was a persistent smell of mold that no amount of cleaning seemed to eradicate. But it was all I could afford, and I tried to make the best of it. The coffee shop where I worked was no paradise either. My boss was a total jerk, constantly breathing down my neck and criticizing every little thing I did. The customers were mostly rude and impatient, treating me like I was invisible, or worse, like I was beneath them. The long hours on my feet were exhausting, and by the end of each shift, my back would ache and my feet would throb. To say I was desperate would be an understatement. I felt trapped, suffocated by my circumstances, and completely powerless to change them. Every day was a struggle, and the weight of it all was crushing me. I started to lose hope, feeling like I was spiraling into a black hole with no way out. One night, after a particularly grueling shift, I sat in my tiny dark apartment, staring at my laptop screen. I was scrolling through social media, seeing all my friends from high school living their best lives, traveling, partying, and generally having a good time. Meanwhile, I was stuck in this hellhole, barely making ends meet. The jealousy and frustration gnawed at me, and I felt a burning desire to escape my miserable reality. That's when I remembered a conversation I'd overheard at the coffee shop a few weeks prior. A couple of my coworkers had been talking in hushed tones about the dark web, sharing stories of people who'd made quick money through various means. At the time, I'd dismissed it as just another urban legend, but now, in my desperation, it seemed like a glimmer of hope. I spent the next few days researching the dark web, learning about how to access it and what to expect. The more I read, the more intrigued I became. Sure, there were horror stories of people getting caught up in illegal activities or falling victim to scams, but there were also tales of individuals who'd managed to make a fortune. It was a gamble, but I felt like I had nothing left to lose. One rainy evening, with my heart pounding in my chest, I decided to take the plunge. I downloaded Tor, the browser that would grant me access to the hidden corners of the internet, and started my journey into the unknown. As I navigated through the labyrinth of anonymous websites and forums, I felt a strange mix of excitement and dread. The dark web was a wild, untamed place filled with shadows and secrets. My initial explorations were cautious. I lurked in forums, reading posts and trying to get a feel for the community. The people there were a diverse bunch, ranging from conspiracy theorists to hackers and everything in between. The more I delved into this underground world, the more I realized how dangerous it could be. But desperation has a way of dulling your sense of danger, and I pressed on, determined to find a way out of my financial hell. It was during one of these late-night sessions that I stumbled upon a chat room that would change my life forever. Little did I know, the decision to enter that virtual space would lead me down a path of deception, betrayal, and ultimately, my own downfall. But at that moment, all I could think about was the possibility of finding a way to make some quick cash without breaking the law. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, and the horrors that awaited me were beyond anything I could have ever imagined. With a mix of fear and determination, I dove deeper into the dark web. Each night after my grueling shifts at the coffee shop, I would sit in my dimly lit apartment, my only illumination coming from the faint glow of my laptop screen. The more I explored, the more I realized how vast and intricate this hidden part of the internet truly was. It was like a sprawling, digital underworld, teeming with secrets and dangers. One night, after hours of aimless browsing, I found myself in a chat room that seemed relatively harmless compared to the others I had come across. The room was filled with people discussing various ways to make money, from freelance work to dubious get-rich-quick schemes. It was here that I first encountered someone with the username Richard22. Richard22 seemed different from the other users. While most of the chat participants were either boasting about their earnings or arguing over the legitimacy of different schemes, Richard22 was calm, collected, and surprisingly helpful. He shared advice on how to avoid scams and offered tips on navigating the dark web safely. His demeanor put me at ease, and I found myself drawn to his seemingly genuine nature. We started chatting, and over the next few days our conversations became more frequent. He was always online, always ready to offer guidance or lend a sympathetic ear. I confided in him about my struggles, my financial woes, and my desperate need for money. He listened patiently, never judging, always offering support. It felt good to have someone to talk to, even if it was a faceless stranger on the dark web. One evening, as we were chatting, I mentioned how much I needed money. I wasn't looking for a handout, just some advice on how to make a bit of extra cash. Richard22 responded with a message that caught me completely off guard. "I'm rich," he typed. "I can help you." I stared at the screen, unsure how to respond. It sounded like a joke, or worse, a setup for some kind of scam. But Richard22 had never given me a reason to distrust him. I laughed it off, typing back a sarcastic reply, but he persisted. "I'm serious," he insisted. "I have more money than I know what to do with. I can help you get back on your feet." Skeptical, I asked him how he planned to do that. He explained that he could send me a credit card loaded with enough money to cover my expenses and then some. It sounded too good to be true, and alarm bells were ringing in my head. But the thought of financial relief was incredibly tempting. "Think about it," he said. "You don't have to decide right now. Just let me know if you're interested." I told him I needed time to think it over. The idea of accepting help from a stranger on the dark web was both terrifying and alluring. I spent the next few days agonizing over the decision. On one hand, I knew it could be a trap. On the other hand, I was desperate, and this seemed like my only way out. I weighed the risks and benefits, my mind constantly racing with thoughts of what could go wrong. What if the card was stolen? What if it was traced back to me? But the idea of finally having enough money to cover my expenses, to live without the constant stress and fear, was overpowering. In the end, desperation won out. I messaged Richard22 telling him I had decided to accept his offer. He responded almost immediately, asking for my address so he could send the card. I hesitated for a moment, but then typed out my address and hit send. A few days later, a plain envelope arrived at my apartment. Inside was a sleek black credit card with my name on it. My heart pounded as I held it in my hands, a mix of excitement and dread coursing through me. This was it, the moment that could change everything. I decided to test the card at a local grocery store. I picked up a few essentials, my heart racing as I approached the checkout. When the cashier swiped the card, my mind was filled with 1,000 worries. But then, to my immense relief, the transaction went through. I couldn't believe it. It actually worked. Over the next few days, I used the card cautiously, making sure not to draw too much attention to myself. It felt like a dream come true. I finally had enough money for rent, bills, and even a few luxuries. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of security and freedom. But as we all know, If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. Little did I know my newfound financial freedom was about to come crashing down around me in the most horrifying way imaginable. I felt like I was walking on clouds. With the black credit card securely in my wallet, I no longer worried about my next meal or whether I'd be able to pay rent on time. It was a surreal feeling, like a heavy weight had been lifted from my shoulders. Every time I swiped the card, a thrill of excitement coursed through me, mixed with a tinge of unease that I tried my best to ignore. Richard, 22, and I continued to chat almost every night. Our conversations grew more personal, more intimate. He seemed genuinely interested in my life, asking about my classes, my job, my dreams. I started to look forward to our nightly exchanges, finding solace in the company of this mysterious benefactor. He never pried too deeply, never made me feel uncomfortable. In fact, he felt like the only person who truly understood my struggles. One night after a particularly long and exhausting shift at the coffee shop, I confided in Richard, 22, about my mounting stress. College was getting tougher, work was more demanding, and despite the financial relief, I was still finding it hard to keep up with everything. "I can help you more," he typed. "If you need anything, just ask." I paused, staring at the screen. What more could I possibly need? But before I could respond, he continued. "I have connections. I can get you anything you need. Just name it." I laughed it off, thanking him but assuring him that I was fine. But deep down, a part of me was curious. What kind of connections did he have? What else could he possibly offer? Over the next few weeks, our chats took on a different tone. Richard, 22, started hinting at other ways he could help me. He talked about investments, business opportunities, and even travel. It was tempting, incredibly so, but I was wary. The card had worked out so far, but I didn't want to push my luck. One night, after a few too many drinks, I let my guard down and asked him why he was helping me. Why, out of all the people on the dark web, had he chosen me? "Because I see potential in you," he replied. "You're smart, resourceful, and you're not afraid to take risks. You remind me of myself at your age." The compliment was flattering, and in my slightly inebriated state, I felt a surge of gratitude. Maybe this wasn't too good to be true. Maybe Richard, 22, was just a kind-hearted person who saw someone in need and decided to help. But as our chats continued, Richard, 22's tone shifted again. He began to ask for small favors in return for his help. Nothing major, just little things. He'd ask me to look up information for him, make a few phone calls, or send emails on his behalf. It seemed harmless enough, so I complied, feeling like I owed him for his generosity. One evening, he asked me to pick up a package for him. It was a small errand, and he assured me it was nothing illegal, just a favor for a friend. I was hesitant, but he had never given me a reason to doubt him, so I agreed. The package was to be picked up from a warehouse on the outskirts of town. It was a sketchy area, and I felt a knot of anxiety in my stomach as I approached the building. But everything went smoothly. I handed over the package to a courier and left, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. When I got home, I messaged Richard, 22, to let him know the job was done. He thanked me profusely, promising that he would make it worth my while. I felt a strange sense of accomplishment, like I had finally done something right. But things started to change after that. Richard, 22's requests became more frequent, more demanding. He began to ask for favors that made me uncomfortable, and when I hesitated, he would remind me of everything he had done for me. The dynamic of our relationship shifted, and I began to feel trapped. One night, I decided to confront him. I told him I couldn't keep doing these favors, that it was becoming too much. His response was chilling. "You owe me," he typed. "Don't forget where you got that card. Don't forget who saved you from your miserable life." A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The tone of his message was threatening, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had been manipulated from the start. I tried to backtrack, to explain that I was grateful but couldn't keep up with his demands. He didn't respond, and a heavy silence hung in the air. The next day, I received a message from an unknown number. It was a photo of my apartment, taken from the street. The implication was clear. Richard, 22, knew where I lived. Fear gripped me, and I realized I was in over my head. I had no idea who this man really was or what he was capable of. I tried to cut off contact, ignoring his messages and avoiding the chat room. But the threats continued. He knew too much about me, and the more I tried to distance myself, the tighter his grip seemed to become. I was living in a nightmare, and there was no escape. My life, which had seemed so promising just weeks before, was unraveling before my eyes. And the worst part was, I had no one to blame but myself. For days, I was paralyzed by fear. Every time I saw a message notification, my heart would race and I would feel sick to my stomach. Richard 22's threats were becoming more menacing, and I knew that ignoring him was no longer an option. The photos of my apartment, the cryptic messages, and the subtle reminders of everything he had done for me were a constant reminder of the precarious situation I was in. One evening, after a particularly stressful day at work, I returned to my apartment to find a small package waiting for me on my doorstep. My hands trembled as I picked it up, a sense of dread washing over me. The package was plain, with no return address, but I knew who it was from. Inside, I found a burner phone and a note. The note was brief, written in neat, precise handwriting. "Call me, Richard 22. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. I felt like I was being pulled deeper into a web of control and manipulation, but I saw no way out. I debated my options, but in the end, fear and desperation won out. I turned on the burner phone and dialed the number pre-programmed into it. Richard 22 answered on the first ring. "Good to hear from you," he said, his voice calm and almost friendly. "I was starting to worry you didn't appreciate all I've done for you." I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "What do you want from me?" "It's simple," he replied. "I need you to do one last favor for me. After that, you're free to go. No more messages, no more threats. Just one last job." My stomach churned. I didn't believe for a second that this would be the end of it, but I felt cornered. "What do you need me to do?" "There's a suitcase at the bus station, locker 237. I need you to retrieve it and bring it to an address I'll send you. Do this, and I promise you'll never hear from me again." Everything in me screamed to refuse, to run, to call the police. But I knew how deeply he had embedded himself into my life, how much he knew about me. And against my better judgment, I agreed. The next day, I went to the bus station, my heart pounding with every step. Locker 237 was easy to find, and inside was a nondescript black suitcase. I grabbed it, feeling the weight of my decision settle heavily on my shoulders. The address Richard 22 had given me was in a part of town I had never been to before. It was a rundown neighborhood, the kind of place where people mind their own business and look the other way. I arrived at a decrepit old house and knocked on the door, my hands shaking. A man opened the door, his face partially hidden in the shadows. He took the suitcase from me without a word and shut the door in my face. I stood there for a moment, stunned and terrified, before quickly walking away. That night, I received a message on the burner phone. "Good job. As promised, you're free to go. Destroy this phone." I felt a wave of relief wash over me, but it was short-lived. As I returned home, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I tried to go about my life, hoping that this nightmare was finally over, but deep down I knew it wasn't. A few days later, while shopping for groceries, I decided to use the credit card one last time. I needed to pick up a few things, and I thought it would be safe. But as soon as I swiped the card at the checkout, a look of concern crossed the cashier's face. She excused herself and walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart racing. Moments later, 2 police officers approached me. They asked me to step outside, and before I knew it, I was handcuffed and being escorted to a police car. Panic surged through me as I realized the gravity of my situation. What had I gotten myself into? At the police station, I was interrogated for hours. They accused me of being involved in a major fraud operation, and my mind reeled as they presented evidence linking me to various criminal activities. The credit card, it turned out, was part of a larger scheme, and I was the unwitting pawn. I tried to explain my side of the story, but the more I talked, the more it sounded like the ramblings of a guilty person. They didn't believe me. I was thrown into a holding cell, my mind racing with fear and regret. For 3 long months I languished in jail, awaiting trial. My life had fallen apart, and I had no one to turn to. My parents were devastated, my friends confused and distant. I had become a pariah, a cautionary tale of what happens when you get involved in things you don't understand. Eventually, the police found enough evidence to prove that I had been manipulated and used by Richard 22. They dropped the charges against me, and I was released, but the damage was done. My life was in shambles, and I had learned a harsh lesson about trust and desperation. Being released from jail was a bittersweet experience. On one hand, I was relieved to be free, but on the other, I was stepping out into a life that had been utterly dismantled. The months in jail had left me a shadow of my former self, paranoid, anxious, and deeply traumatized. When I returned to my apartment, I found it in disarray. Bills had piled up, and my landlord had given up hope of ever seeing me again. My belongings were packed in boxes, a clear signal that I was no longer welcome there. I had no job, no money, and a tarnished reputation that made finding new employment nearly impossible. The first thing I did was destroy the burner phone, as Richard 22 had instructed. I didn't want any more reminders of the nightmare I had lived through. I also got rid of my laptop, the one I had used to access the dark web. It felt symbolic, like I was severing ties with the dark part of my life. With nowhere else to go, I returned to my parents' home. They were supportive but wary, having been through the emotional roller coaster of my arrest and imprisonment. It took time to rebuild their trust, and even longer to begin to trust myself again. I spent the next several months trying to piece my life back together. Therapy helped, but the scars ran deep. The sense of betrayal, the feeling of being manipulated and used, haunted me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Richard 22's messages, heard his voice in my head. I tried to find work, but my record made it difficult. Employers were hesitant to hire someone with a recent brush with the law, even if I had been exonerated. The stigma followed me everywhere, a constant reminder of my naivety and desperation. Slowly, I began to rebuild. I took on odd jobs, anything to make ends meet. I went back to school part-time, determined to finish my degree, though the path was now much harder. I avoided technology as much as possible, fearing the slippery slope back into the dark web's treacherous depths. In my free time, I started writing. It became a form of therapy, a way to process my experiences and make sense of the chaos that had consumed my life. I wrote about the dark web, about my interactions with Richard 22, and about the lessons I had learned. It was cathartic, and it helped me to see my ordeal in a different light. One of the biggest lessons I learned was about the nature of desperation. When you're at your lowest, the promise of an easy way out can be incredibly tempting. But those promises often come with strings attached. Strings that can ensnare and entangle you in ways you never imagined. I also learned to be wary of strangers, especially those who offer help without any apparent motive. Trust is something that should be earned, not given freely, especially in the shadowy corners of the internet where anonymity breeds deceit. Years have passed since those dark days, and while the memories still linger, they no longer have the power to control me. I've managed to build a new life. one where I am more cautious and more aware of the potential dangers that lurk behind seemingly benign offers of help. If there's one piece of advice I can offer to anyone reading this, it's this. Stay away from the dark web. It's a place where the line between right and wrong is blurred, and where the innocent can easily become ensnared in webs of deceit and manipulation. If something seems too good to be true, it probably is. Trust your instincts and don't let desperation drive you into the arms of those who would take advantage of your vulnerability. In the end, I survived, but not without scars. That was the last time I will ever go on the dark web and look for a salvation there. I'm done with the dark web and the dangerous parts of the internet. I will try to stay as safe as possible. Goodbye, Reddit, and have a nice day. Hey everyone, I don't usually post stuff like this, but I need to get this off my chest. I'm 23 years old and attending a soccer academy in the hopes of going pro. It's a pretty intense place, with training sessions, drills, and matches almost every day. I live and breathe soccer, but a few weeks ago I suffered a pretty bad knee injury. Nothing too catastrophic, but enough to put me on the sidelines for a while. With all this free time on my hands, I quickly grew bored. There's only so much Netflix you can watch, and scrolling through Instagram felt like torture watching everyone else training and having fun. I needed something different, something to occupy my mind. That's when I remembered a conversation I had with a couple of my teammates about the dark web. It was all jokes and spooky stories at the time, but now curiosity got the better of me. So, one lazy afternoon, I decided to download Tor and take a little peek. For those who don't know, Tor is a browser that lets you access the dark web. It's like the internet's seedy underbelly where you can find all sorts of crazy and illegal stuff. Now, I wasn't looking for anything bad. I just wanted to see what all the fuss was about. As I set everything up, I felt a weird mix of excitement and anxiety. There was this nagging voice in the back of my head telling me it was a bad idea, but the boredom won out. I opened Tor and started exploring. The interface looked old school and kind of clunky, nothing like the sleek browsers we're used to. At first, it was pretty boring. A lot of the sites were dead links, and the ones that did load were mostly forums with people discussing conspiracy theories or selling questionable goods. Nothing too shocking, but still a bit unsettling, knowing these hidden corners of the internet existed. I was just about to log off when I stumbled upon a website that caught my eye. It was a marketplace of sorts, but not like Amazon or eBay. This one had an eerie feel to it, almost like it was trying too hard to look normal. The site was selling all kinds of devices that looked like phones but with no brands or logos. Just plain black rectangles with vague descriptions like ultimate privacy and secure communication guaranteed. It wasn't the devices that intrigued me though. It was the chat room attached to the site. Curiosity got the better of me again and I clicked on it. There were a few people chatting, but nothing too weird at first. Just some back and forth about the devices and their supposed features. I decided to dive in and see what it was all about. Looking back now, I wish I'd just closed my laptop and found something else to do. But hindsight is 20/20, and I had no idea the rabbit hole I was about to fall into. What started as a way to kill time during my recovery turned into something far more sinister than I ever could have imagined, and it all began with a simple "hey" in that dark web chat room. So there I was, sitting in my dorm room with my leg propped up, staring at my laptop screen. The chat room on this mysterious dark web marketplace seemed quiet, just a few users discussing the devices. My heart was pounding, but I convinced myself it was just harmless curiosity. I typed a simple "hey" into the chat box and hit send. Almost immediately a response popped up. "Hey there, new user. Did you read the rules?" Rules? I hadn't seen any rules. I figured it was just some standard stuff, so I decided to bluff my way through. "Yeah, I read them," I replied. A pause. Then another message appeared. "If you read the rules, We wouldn't be able to see you or your location. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, not quite processing what they meant. How could they know where I was? Before I could think of a response, another message popped up. This one was different. It was in a private chat box. The message was simple, just an image file. With trembling hands, I clicked on it. The picture loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, revealing my worst nightmare. It was a photo of me, sitting in my dorm room, taken from the perspective of my laptop's webcam. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. Then another message appeared beneath the photo. Nice room. You should really lock your doors better. I could barely breathe. This had to be some kind of sick joke, right? I scanned the room, trying to find a hidden camera or something, but there was nothing. My dorm room was locked, and no one could have gotten in without me knowing. Then another message appeared, this time with my full name and address. I sat there, paralyzed with fear. How did they know so much about me? I was careful. I used Tor. I didn't give out any personal information. I didn't understand how this was happening. The chat box dinged again. I'm the owner of this website, the message read. You've broken the rules and now you have two choices. Buy one of our devices or I will leak your photos and sensitive information all over the dark web. My mind raced. I couldn't let that happen. I couldn't let my private information be plastered all over the internet. I frantically typed back, my fingers shaking. I'll buy it. Just tell me what to do. The owner responded almost immediately, giving me instructions on how to purchase the device using Bitcoin. I barely understood half of what he was saying, but I followed the steps as best as I could. I had to transfer an absurd amount of money for a device that I didn't even know if I wanted or needed. I felt trapped, like a mouse in a cage with no way out. The fear and anxiety were suffocating, but I had no choice. I completed the transaction, praying that this would be the end of it. As soon as I hit send on the payment, the chat room went silent. No more messages, no more threats, just an empty, eerie silence. I logged off and shut down my laptop, but the damage was done. My mind was racing, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every creak and groan of the dorm seemed amplified, and I jumped at every little noise. Sleep was impossible that night. I thought paying for the device would be the end of my nightmare, but little did I know. It was only the beginning. The next morning, I received an email confirming the shipment of the device. It would arrive in a few days, and until then, I had to live with the constant fear that the owner was still watching me. The days that followed were a blur of paranoia and anxiety. Every time my phone buzzed, I jumped. Every knock on the door made my heart race. I felt like a prisoner in my own life, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And then the device arrived. The device arrived on a rainy Wednesday morning. I was jolted awake by the knock on my dorm door. I peered through the peephole and saw the delivery guy holding a small, nondescript package. My heart was pounding as I signed for it and brought it inside. The package was surprisingly light. I tore it open and found a plain black phone inside, just like the ones I'd seen on the marketplace. No logos, no brand name, just a simple black rectangle. It looked and felt cheap. Nothing like the high-end device the dark web owner had promised. I sat on my bed staring at the phone, my mind racing with a million thoughts. Why had I been so stupid to get involved in this? I should have known better than to mess around on the dark web. My phone buzzed, snapping me out of my thoughts. It was a private message from the marketplace owner. Glad you got the device. Now you're one of us. Don't try anything funny or we'll be watching. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I had to get rid of this thing, but I couldn't just throw it away. I needed to know if it was dangerous, if it was somehow tracking me or worse. That's when I decided to take it to the police. The local police station wasn't far, and I made the trip on crutches, every step reminding me of how vulnerable I felt. I handed the device over to an officer, explaining as much as I could without sounding completely paranoid. They took it seriously enough and said they'd have their tech team look into it. Days passed, and I tried to return to some semblance of normalcy. My knee was healing and I started light training sessions again, but the anxiety never left. Every time I opened my laptop, I felt like someone was watching me. Every time my phone buzzed, I feared it was another message from the dark web. Then, a week later, I got a call from the police. They'd analyzed the device, and the officer told me to come in. I hobbled back to the station, my stomach in knots. The officer who greeted me had a serious look on his face. "We took apart the phone and analyzed it," he said. "There's nothing special about it. No hidden trackers, no malware, nothing. It's just a cheap, generic phone." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "So, I got scammed?" He nodded. "Looks like it. But the fact that they knew so much about you is concerning. You need to be more careful online. Change all your passwords, keep your webcam covered, and don't visit any suspicious sites." I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear. I had been scammed out of a lot of money, but at least there wasn't some high-tech device tracking my every move. However, the fact that the dark web owner knew my face and address still haunted me. I thanked the officer and headed back to my dorm, feeling a little lighter, but still wary. Over the next few weeks, I did everything the officer suggested. I changed all my passwords, covered my webcam, and avoided the dark web like the plague. Life slowly returned to normal. My knee healed and I got back to full training with my team. But the experience had left a scar. I was more paranoid, more cautious, and always looking over my shoulder. The dark web owner never contacted me again, and for that I was grateful. I realized I had been lucky. Things could have been much worse. I learned a valuable lesson about curiosity and the dangers of the internet's darker corners. Even though I was out a lot of money, I was safe, and that was what mattered most. But sometimes, late at night, I still think about the dark web and that eerie chat room. The fear and paranoia still linger, a reminder of how close I came to real danger. It's a mistake I'll never make again. Just when I thought I was moving past the ordeal, I received another message that reignited my fears. It was a Friday evening, and I was settling in to watch a movie when my phone buzzed. My heart sank as I saw an unknown number pop up on the screen. Reluctantly, I opened the message. "Hope you're enjoying the phone. Don't forget we're still watching." I felt a wave of nausea. It had been weeks since the police assured me the phone was harmless. Yet here was this menacing message. I knew I needed to keep my cool, but panic was setting in. I replied, hoping to keep the situation under control. "What do you want from me?" The response was immediate. "I want you to understand the consequences of breaking the rules. You need to buy another device or else." My mind raced. How could they still be watching me? The police had said the phone was clean, yet somehow they were still tracking me. I needed to think quickly. I couldn't keep playing this game, handing over money to these faceless threats. I decided to confront the situation head on. "Why are you doing this? What do you get out of it?" There was a pause, and for a moment, I thought maybe they wouldn't reply. Then the screen lit up with a new message. "Because I can. Because people like you think they can just wander into the dark web without consequences. You need to learn a lesson." I felt a cold sweat break out. This wasn't just about money. It was about power and control. I couldn't give in again. I needed to find a way out. I decided to take a bold step and contact the police again, this time showing them the new messages. The next morning, I went back to the police station. The officer I had spoken to before was surprised to see me, but listened as I explained the new development. I showed him the messages, and he frowned, deep in thought. "We need to take this seriously," he said. "It's clear they still have access to some of your information. Let's start by checking your devices again." I handed over my phone and laptop, and they assured me their tech team would do a more thorough analysis this time. They also suggested I stay with a friend for a few days just to be safe. Feeling a bit more secure, I called up my best friend Jake and explained the situation. He was shocked but told me I could crash at his place for as long as I needed. Jake was one of the few people I trusted completely, and just being with someone else made me feel safer. The next few days were tense. The police were combing through my devices, and I was constantly on edge, expecting another threatening message at any moment. But it was eerily quiet. I started to wonder if my defiance had scared them off, or if they were planning something worse. Then, on the third day, I got a call from the police. "We found something," the officer said. "Can you come to the station?" My heart pounded as I made my way there. When I arrived, the officer led me to a small room where another officer was waiting with my devices. They looked serious and my anxiety spiked. "We found a hidden piece of software on your laptop," the tech officer explained. "It's sophisticated spyware that can access your webcam, microphone, and even track your keystrokes. That's how they've been watching you." I felt a mix of anger and relief. They had found the source, but I was furious at how deeply my privacy had been violated. "Can you remove it? And can we trace it back to whoever did this?" "We've removed it," the officer assured me. "Tracing it is more complicated, but we're working on it. In the meantime, we recommend you get new devices and be extremely cautious online." I thanked them and left, feeling a bit lighter. At least now I knew how they had been spying on me. I decided to follow their advice, purchasing a new laptop and phone and setting up every security measure I could think of. The experience had shaken me to my core, but I was determined to move forward. I learned a harsh lesson about the dark web and the dangers lurking there. I vowed never to let curiosity lead me down such a dangerous path again. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Slowly, the fear and paranoia began to fade. I focused on my training, my friends, and trying to regain a sense of normalcy. But the memory of those threats, the feeling of being watched, still lingered at the back of my mind, a permanent reminder of the darkness that had touched my life. Life started to return to normal, or as normal as it could be after such a harrowing experience. I settled back into my training routine, my knee healing nicely, and the dread that had clouded my days began to dissipate. But the paranoia never completely left. Every time my phone buzzed, I felt a jolt of anxiety. Every knock on the door made my heart skip a beat. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, somewhere, was still watching. A couple of weeks after getting my new devices, I received an email from an unfamiliar address. My breath caught in my throat as I opened it, half expecting another threat. But it was from the police. "We've traced the spyware back to a server, but it's part of a larger network that's difficult to pinpoint. We're working on it, but we wanted to let you know we're making progress. Stay vigilant." It was a small comfort, knowing they were still on the case, but I realized I couldn't live my life in constant fear. I had to take control and move forward. With the support of my friends, especially Jake, I started to feel more secure. One evening, as Jake and I were watching a game, he turned to me and said, "You know, you can't let this define you. What happened was messed up, but you're stronger than this." His words resonated with me. I had been letting fear control my life, and I needed to reclaim it. So, I decided to focus on what I loved, soccer. Training became my escape, my way of taking back control. Then one day, a package arrived at my dorm. I hadn't ordered anything, and my stomach churned with anxiety as I picked it up. There was no return address. With trembling hands, I opened it, revealing a small, plain black phone, the same kind I had bought from the dark web. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at it. There was a note inside the package. "Consider this a reminder. We'll always be watching." I felt a cold sweat break out. After everything, they were still out there, still watching. I didn't know what to do. I took the package to the police, hoping they could find something, anything that could lead them to these people. The officer I spoke to was sympathetic, but realistic. We'll look into it. But these guys are good at covering their tracks. Just keep being cautious. I left the station feeling defeated. Despite all the precautions, all the changes, the threat still loomed over me. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out my next move. Then it hit me. They thrived on fear, on control. If I let them dictate my life, they would win. I had to live my life, not just survive it. With renewed determination, I decided to push forward. I wouldn't let them break me. In the months that followed, I threw myself into my training and studies. I strengthened my security measures and stayed off the dark web entirely. I surrounded myself with friends and family, the people who truly mattered. The dark web owner never contacted me again. Maybe they got bored, or maybe the police were closing in. Either way, I was determined not to live in fear. I learned to be cautious, but I also learned to live. The experience changed me. It made me more aware of the dangers that lurk in the shadows of the internet, but it also made me stronger, more resilient. I faced my fears and came out the other side, scarred but not broken. Now, whenever I hear a knock on the door or my phone buzzes, I still feel a flicker of anxiety, but I remind myself that I've faced worse and survived. The dark web may have touched my life, but it didn't define it.